On a still night along Center Creek, when the mist hangs low and the trees seem older than memory, whispers rise of an Osage warrior and a severed head found on the bank. Some say the land remembers what people forget. Others ask a quieter question. What really happened here on those long forgotten nights by the drifting water there? Before we step further into the past, I welcome you wherever you may be watching tonight. Share your place an hour below and join our circle along these Ozark paths. The river at dusk holds its color a moment longer before giving it back to night, and that is where our path begins. Center Creek moves slow through this country, bending through reeds and over stones that have listened to centuries of footsteps. Long before cabins rose, long before riders from the east carved trails through the brush, the Osage walked these banks as if they were walking through a living memory. To them, the land was not simply terrain. It was a presence, a companion, something that had watched them grow from a small people into the children of the middle waters. Their stories say they emerged from the mouth of a great red bird, placed upon this soil with a charge to keep balance, to move with the seasons, and to hold fast to the rhythm of the hills. Travelers from the 17th and 18th centuries wrote of the Osage with a tone that wavered between admiration and unease. They described towering men, shoulders broad, bearing themselves with a solemn, deliberate calm that rarely cracked. French traders noted the way the Osage stood silent before speaking, and the way they observed a stranger with eyes that measured not just the man, but the intention he carried. To the early Europeans, the Osage seemed carved from the very limestone bluffs that rise above the rivers of the Ozark Plateau, and in truth, the land shaped them. The hills offered shelter, the forests gave game, the valleys held crops. Every ridgeline and winding waterway stitched together a world where families lived in lodges of bent saplings covered with hides, where women tended fields of corn and squash, and where young warriors learned to move through the woods without stirring a leaf. In these early days, the Ozarks were quieter, but never empty. Light smoke curled upward from Osage villages set on defensible overlooks. Footpaths ran like threads from camp to camp, worn smooth by generations of moccasins. The great bison herds grazed farther west, yet hunting parties moved between prairie and forest, sometimes traveling for weeks before returning home with stories carried on the wind. It was a life both harsh and deeply ordered, a life where every season held a known ritual. Elders spoke to children about the sky people, the earth people, and the long chain of ancestors who kept watch. And down along Center Creek, morning fog clung thick around the trees, while the first sun glinted off the river stones like beads of polished bone. To stand here now is to feel time layered, for the land has not forgotten its first keepers. When you walk near the creek and hear nothing but the ticking of insects, there is a sense that someone once stood in that same place, quietly listening. The Osage believed the world spoke in subtle ways, and that silence itself carried meaning. Hunters paused before crossing a ridge. Women gathering roots hummed low songs that matched the movement of their hands. Even children were taught to step lightly, because sound traveled far in the hills. That discipline, that quiet knowledge of the woods, would later shape how others saw them, especially during the violent years that would sweep over the Ozarks and leave stories like the Beheading at Center Creek lodged deep in the region's memory. But those darker days were still far off. In these first centuries along Center Creek, the Osage world held steady. The French traded metal tools and weapons, and for a time there was mutual respect, even reliance. The Osage controlled vast hunting grounds and held influence over neighboring nations. They commanded the landscape, and they understood how to move through it in ways settlers coming later could scarcely imagine. Their warriors could travel miles in silence, reading broken twigs, shifting bird calls, or the faintest impression left in soft earth. When conflict did arise, it carried an inevitability rooted in competition for survival rather than malice. Even the earliest violent episodes recorded by European witnesses reflect a world where every choice cost something, and where every life was part of a broader pattern of balance and retaliation. Yet even an ordered world is never beyond shadow. The hills themselves hold tension, the kind that builds slowly as centuries turn. In the Ozark Plateau, storms gather without warning, and the same land that nurtures life can swallow it whole beneath a flooded creek or a fallen bluff. The Osage understood this dual nature. They held ceremonies for protection and thanksgiving, but they did not pretend the world owed them safety. When a storm swept across the prairies, they watched it as a teacher. When a rival nation attacked a hunting party, they marked it as a cycle long repeated in the stories of their ancestors. Life here demanded resilience, and the Osage carried that resilience through countless winters in these hills. Gradually, though, whispers began to hover around the edges of Osage territory. Traders from beyond the Mississippi spoke of an expanding American presence, of surveyors drawing lines that ignored ancient trails, of settlers pushing westward in wagons heavy with possessions and expectations. At first, these were distant rumors, carried along rivers and repeated in trading posts. But as the years passed, the trickle of newcomers grew, and with them came pressure the Osage could feel beneath their feet. The hills around Center Creek watched those early changes in silence, just as they watch now. Still, in this moment of our story, long before the beheading tale took root, before the fear and the dark headlines and the half-remembered accounts whispered across generations, the Osage remained the rightful shape of the land. Their shadows moved with the trees, their voices drifted across the creek at dusk. Their warriors strode confidently through low light, painted for ceremony or hunt, carrying themselves with the quiet gravity that made such an impression on every outsider who crossed their path. If you stand by Center Creek in the evening and feel a heaviness settle around your shoulders, it is not an ominous sign but a remnant of presence. It is the echo of centuries, when the Osage walked freely across the hills, when the land knew their names, when the world before conflict still breathed easily. But like all beginnings, this one carries the faint edge of an ending. The still river at dusk holds its color a moment longer, then gives it back to night, as if preparing itself for the many storms yet to come. And somewhere in that fading light, the first quiet tremor of change ripples across the water, unnoticed by the people who called this place home. The river that once held its color has now gone dark, yet the trail that follows its bend remains visible beneath the thin moonlight. Those footsteps we heard at the end of the last tale deepen into prints along the soft earth, heading westward toward a land beginning to strain under forces neither quiet nor gentle. As American expansion pressed into the interior, the old order of the Ozarks trembled, though at first hardly anyone could see it clearly. Change never arrives in one violent burst. It comes instead like a slow pressure behind the ribs, a dull ache that takes shape only when it is far too late to reverse. For the Osage, whose villages once dominated the high plateaus and wide valleys for untold generations, that pressure began with treaties signed in faraway rooms, under lights they did not know, and with motives they did not fully trust. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 sent a current through the region stronger than any storm rolling off the plains. American surveyors soon appeared, drawing lines across maps that had once belonged only to rivers and ridges. Their instruments clicked, and their stakes drove into the soil with a confidence that signaled permanence. To the Osage watching from the tree line, these men represented a different sort of presence. The French, for all their ambitions, had lived among them, intermarried, traded, and relied on Osage goodwill. Americans, however, brought a new language of settlement and ownership. They wanted land to farm, land to clear, land to claim. Their families followed with wagons creaking under pots, tools, and the uneasily packed hopes of a new life beyond the Mississippi. What began as isolated cabins soon grew into clusters of settlers who saw the Ozarks not as an ancestral home of a sovereign people, but as open opportunity promised by their government. Those early communities situated near water sources like Center Creek clung tightly together for safety and support. They planted corn in small clearings, built lean-to shelters while they hewed logs into cabin walls, and kept rifles propped near the door long after dark. For all their determination, fear lingered in every holler. Stories had drifted eastward about the size, strength, and ferocity of the Osage warriors. Some were true, some greatly exaggerated, but fear rarely cares about the difference. By the 1810s, the world around Center Creek was changing faster than anyone could fully understand. Treaties forced the Osage to cede millions of acres, each agreement pushing them farther from lands their ancestors had walked since the world was new. The ink on those documents dried quickly, but the consequences spread slowly, sinking deep into the soil and the minds of the people who lived here. The Osage did not simply fade away from the ceded areas. They continued to hunt, to travel familiar trails, to revisit sacred places. This movement, entirely natural to them, sparked unease among settlers who expected boundaries drawn on maps to be obeyed on the ground. But maps seldom capture the truth of a landscape. Center Creek remained what it had always been, a narrow, winding artery threading through dense woodland where the presence of one group could be sensed long before it was seen. It was during these years that tensions simmered into something sharper. Isolated cabins reported missing livestock. A settler claimed his tracks were followed for miles by unseen figures. Another insisted he glimpsed an Osage warrior watching from behind a sycamore trunk at dusk. These accounts might have been true. They might also have been shaped by unease and rumor. For every claim of danger, there was at least one peaceful interaction: trade for meat, assistance during winter storms, or brief, wordless exchanges on woodland trails. Yet only the alarming stories traveled far. Fear spreads quickly in a frontier community, especially among people unfamiliar with the land and those who first inhabited it. Important to remember is that the Osage themselves were under enormous pressure from multiple sides. Forced treaty after forced treaty left them with fewer resources and fewer options. Hunting grounds shrank, game patterns changed, rival tribes, sensing vulnerability, tested boundaries. The American government promised supplies and provisions to compensate for lost land, but those promises often failed to arrive or arrived late and in poor condition. Desperation does not announce itself politely. When a people are cornered, even proud and disciplined warriors can be driven into actions that later generations puzzle over through the fog of incomplete records. Along Center Creek, the land still tried to hold its peace. Thick stands of sycamore and walnut shaded the creek beds. The water ran shallow and clear, showing minnows darting between stones. But beneath this calm surface, both settlers and Osage felt the world tightening. The quiet trail that skirted the creek grew more traveled by scouts, traders, and wandering families looking for new claims. Each passing year brought more boots, more axes, more rifles. And with every new arrival, the distance between the two worlds shrank. It was no longer unusual for settlers to encounter Osage hunting parties moving through territory the newcomers believed was theirs. Arguments broke out. Accusations followed. Small skirmishes flickered like sparks that might catch flame at any moment. During this period, Center Creek became a border in all but name. On one side lay cabins and new fields. On the other lay ancient trails leading into the deeper Ozarks. It was the sort of line that exists not on paper, but in the minds of people wary of one another. Settlers warned their children not to wander far past the creek. Osage scouts kept a watchful eye on smoke rising from newly built chimneys. Night sounds, owls, coyotes, shifting branches, were interpreted with suspicion on both sides. A simple rustle in the brush could send a settler reaching for his rifle, or an Osage hunter tightening his grip on a bow. As the 18-teens turned into the 1820s, the pressure built toward a breaking point. News traveled slowly across these hills, but the people living here were deeply aware of the shifting political landscape. Settlers felt empowered by the promises of an expanding nation. The Osage felt the weight of diminishing territory and perceived threats. Distrust thickened the air the way summer humidity fills a valley. Even peaceful encounters were tinged with wariness, as if both sides sensed that something inevitable was approaching. Center Creek itself responded in its own quiet way. The banks eroded more quickly where travelers crossed. The trails on each side widened under the repeated passage of boots and moccasins. If the land remembers, as many old-timers claim, then it surely felt the coming conflict as a tightening in its ancient bones. And though no storm had yet broken, the ridgelines seemed to hold their breath. These footsteps we have followed, from the river's edge to the emerging frontier, pause now on the trail as the moon slips behind a cloud. For a moment, all is still. But tension does not vanish in stillness. It gathers there, waiting, deepening the dark around the trees. And it is along this quiet, uncertain path that the first true conflict near Center Creek will take shape. The footsteps that paused beneath the clouded moon now carry us down toward the low bend of Center Creek, where the land narrows and the trees crowd close enough that even daylight feels reluctant to settle. It is here, in this tightening of woods and water, that the world before the storm begins to show its early tremors. Center Creek in those years was not the creek we know today. Its banks were less tamed, its crossings more treacherous, and the land around it still bore the marks of older, quieter centuries. Travelers spoke of its odd hush at midday, of the way sound seemed to vanish into the thick timber rather than spread through it. Some said the creek was shy, others said it was watchful, and still others insisted it was simply the nature of the Ozarks, where sound travels strangely and silence can feel like a second presence beside you. Settlements here remained small, little more than clusters of cabins and smokehouses scattered along the water's edge. These were families who had ventured farther west than most, carving homesteads out of forest that had known only Osage lodges and game trails for untold generations. Their days were spent clearing brush, tending crops, mending tools, and keeping an uneasy eye on the woods. Lumbering trees creaked at night, and coyotes cried along the ridge. But what frightened settlers most was what they could not see. Many of them came from flatter country, where distance was open and danger could be spotted long before it reached the doorstep. But Center Creek was a different teacher. Here, the land wrapped around itself in folds of stone and shadow. A man could stand 30 paces from his own gate and disappear behind a screen of sycamore trunks. The settlers sensed, often without knowing why, that they were being observed far more often than they were observing anyone else. Stories from this time, and there were many, often began the same way. Someone out gathering wood caught sight of a figure slipping between trees. A hunter, returning late from checking his traps, thought he heard low murmurs in a language he could not identify. A woman drawing water from the creek felt the hairs on her neck rise though the woods around her were perfectly still. These moments were rarely discussed openly. To admit fear was to acknowledge vulnerability in a land where vulnerability could cost a family everything. Instead, these stories drifted quietly from porch to porch, carried in low tones once the children had gone to bed. Some of these sightings may well have been Osage hunters moving through familiar ground. Others may have been nothing more than illusion, the mind's attempt to impose sense on the tangled light between branches. Yet in a place already weighted by suspicion, even imagined shapes could deepen unease. Those who lived closer to the heart of Center Creek territory often spoke of the water itself as a boundary. On the near side, fields of newly planted corn rose in wavering rows. On the far side, the forest thickened, swallowing sunlight and sound with equal appetite. Settlers rarely ventured beyond that line without purpose, and never without caution. It was understood, though never formally agreed upon, that certain areas belonged to older ways and older memories. A few settlers tried to show respect, leaving small offerings near certain groves or avoiding the old mounds entirely. Others dismissed such gestures as superstition, but respect and disregard alike traveled in the air, shaping how each inhabitant, newcomer or native, perceived the increasingly fragile balance of the region. Of the Osage presence along Center Creek during these years, little was recorded in official documents, yet much was remembered in stories. Hunting parties continued to pass through, though less frequently. Tracks were found near the water, sometimes fresh, sometimes distorted by rain. Smoke from distant campfires rose through the canopy on cold mornings. Now and then, a settler child claimed to hear drumming carried faintly on the wind, though no adult could say for certain if the sound was real or imagined. The Osage moved with a quiet confidence born of generations of familiarity with the land, but even they felt the ground shifting beneath their feet. The treaties had taken great swaths of territory, and the new settlements pressed into corridors once used freely for travel. Warriors and elders understood that the world was changing, and their presence along Center Creek carried not just tradition, but vigilance. This vigilance did not go unnoticed. A settler scouting for new farmland once described seeing an Osage warrior standing perfectly still on a rocky outcrop above the creek. The man was watching the water, not the settler, but the encounter left a deep impression. The warrior's posture held neither threat nor fear, but something heavier, perhaps a resignation or an enduring claim. The settler returned home and told no one of the sighting for weeks, yet the memory clung to him, shaping his sense of the land. It is in such small encounters that tension silently curls, for meaning grows in the spaces between what is known and what is merely felt. More troubling were the rumors that spread after several hunters from the settlement failed to return from a foray into deeper timber. They were seasoned woodsmen familiar with the region, cautious and experienced. When they did not appear by nightfall, neighbors assured one another that delays were common and not cause for alarm. But when a second day passed with no sign of them, conversations grew quieter. People avoided the subject in daylight, then spoke of it in whispers once the lamps were lit. Some feared the men had fallen to injury or accident. The terrain was unforgiving, and a misstep near a bluff could end a life quickly. Others believed they might have encountered one of the Osage hunting parties. Whether such an encounter would have led to violence was uncertain, but uncertainty breeds fear faster than truth ever could. Meanwhile, the land remained indifferent. Winds moved through the trees. Animals continued their restless cycles. Center Creek carried on its slow journey without regard to the tension building along its banks. And yet, for those who lived nearby, a subtle shift was taking place. They felt it in the stillness of early morning, in the strange quiet of the forest just before dusk, in the uneasy silence shared between neighbors who sensed conflict gathering like a summer storm. The simplest tasks, fetching water, gathering berries, tending livestock, were accompanied now by quick glances over shoulders and a growing awareness that the world they inhabited was shrinking, tightening around them like a narrowing path. Children, perceptive in ways adults often overlook, sensed this change as well. They listened at night to their parents' hushed conversations and noted the way the older children were told not to wander too far. Some recalled seeing their fathers cleaning rifles more often or noticing traps laid closer to home. A few remembered glimpses, vivid or imagined, of tall figures disappearing into the woods, shadows that moved with purpose and vanished before a name could be spoken. These impressions, carried into adulthood, became part of the oral history of Center Creek, shaping how the region remembered the years leading up to the darker days ahead. And so the lantern glow that closed our last chapter flickers again here. A single cabin light shining across the creek, its thin halo swallowed by encroaching night. That glow marks the quiet yet pivotal moment before fear becomes certainty, before rumor becomes recorded incident, before Center Creek becomes more than a place on a map. It becomes a threshold. The lantern trembles as a breeze moves across the clearing, and with that tremor, the story shifts. The stillness that settles in its wake holds a question the land will soon answer in its own way, whether gently or with a sudden, violent clarity. The lantern flickers once more, casting its small circle of light deeper into the darkness, and then the woods beyond it move. The lantern's trembling glow fades into the deeper shadows of the trees, and in that dimming light, the world beyond the cabin begins to gather its old, quiet warnings. The movement in the woods is small at first, a shift of branches, a weight of silence settling heavier than before, but it marks the place where caution becomes fear, and where the path of Center Creek turns toward a sharper and more dangerous edge. In those years, the war trail was not a single road or a marked line on any surveyor's map. It was a drifting zone of tension, defined not by boundaries, but by encounters, misunderstandings, and the relentless pressure of two worlds forced too close together. The settlers living along the creek did not know the term war trail, but they felt its shape. The Osage, for their part, understood far better what it meant when their hunting grounds filled with strangers carrying rifles, axes, and the certainty that the land had been promised to them by distant authorities. The war trail along Center Creek began with small incidents, hardly more than sparks at the time, yet each one deepened the distrust already thick in the air. A family awoke to find their smokehouse raided, meat missing, tracks leading off into the woods. The prints were unclear, and though some settlers blamed wolves, others whispered that they had seen moccasin marks near the bank. A few weeks later, a trapper returned to his lean-to to find his gear scattered, his traps destroyed, and arrows left upright in the ground like warnings. The Osage denied these acts when confronted, and indeed some incidents may have been the work of desperate drifters or other indigenous groups moving through the territory. But fear does not sort evidence carefully. It gathers every doubt, every rumor, every unexplained sound in the night, and stacks them into a tower of suspicion. It was during these unsettled months that travelers began reporting encounters they could not fully explain. A group of settlers heading south claimed they saw figures shadowing them for miles through the trees. A young boy fishing along the creek insisted he heard chanting on the wind, faint but rhythmic, carrying from a stand of timber across the water. An elderly trapper, a man not prone to panic, told neighbors that he had come across a fresh fire pit and footprints circling his campsite. He did not stay to investigate. None of these moments erupted into violence, but each shaped the belief that the woods held eyes, and that those eyes belonged to warriors who no longer felt safe in their own ancestral corridors. The Osage themselves faced growing hardship. Their villages were pressed into smaller territories. Buffalo were retreating farther west. Game patterns shifted as more settlers cleared land and disrupted the balance of the hills. Promised government supplies often arrived spoiled or incomplete. Hunger drove some to desperation. Pride drove others to anger. And confusion, born from two cultures with entirely different systems of land, honor, and justice, wove itself into every uneasy meeting along Center Creek. When an Osage warrior returned to camp and found his hunting grounds taken, he did not see pioneers pursuing a dream. He saw trespassers carving into sacred space. When a settler found footprints near his homestead, he did not see a hunter reclaiming his ancestral trail. He saw a threat pressing closer to his family's fragile shelter. This friction deepened further as rumors spread from the north and west, where encounters between native nations and frontier settlers had already erupted into violence. News in the early 19th century traveled slowly, often distorted, and always heavy with the biases of those telling it. A skirmish hundreds of miles away could become, by the time it reached the Ozarks, a tale of unprovoked attack. The settlers of Center Creek heard stories of burned cabins, missing travelers, entire families lost in the woods. Whether such events occurred as reported hardly mattered. The tales shaped behavior and fueled the belief that danger lurked just beyond the tree line. For the Osage, too, the stories carried weight. They heard of American militia patrols, of settlers forming armed groups to push native families farther west, of treaties broken before the ink dried. Young warriors raised on traditions of bravery and defense felt compelled to protect their people. Elders counseled caution, but caution does little to quiet the heart of a man who sees his homeland shrinking beneath the march of strangers. The war trail was not declared. It simply emerged, shaped by fear, necessity, and the unspoken understanding that conflict was no longer avoidable. It is during this tense, shifting time that Center Creek becomes something more than a quiet waterway. It becomes a fault line. Travelers who once moved freely now traveled in groups. Hunters who once walked alone now kept a tighter grip on their rifles. Women gathering berries or herbs stayed closer to home, their baskets half filled, but their eyes scanning the shadowed timber. Even the children sensed the change. They played less often near the creek, and when they did, they returned home quickly at the first hint of dusk. Near one of the creek's narrower crossings, a trading party reported seeing an Osage band watching from the ridge. The warriors did not approach, did not lift their weapons, did not shout or gesture. They simply stood in silence, a line of motionless figures outlined against the sky. The traders moved on, but the image of that silent observation spread through the settlements like a cold wind. Some took it as a threat. Others, more familiar with Osage ways, believed it was a warning or a message of endurance. Yet even among those who tried to interpret the moment with nuance, unease lingered. Silence can carry many meanings, and none of them are easily forgotten. Then came the first death recorded by settlers along Center Creek. It was a hunter, found days after he failed to return home. His body showed signs of struggle. The tracks around the site were difficult to read, muddled by rain and scavenging animals. The settlers concluded he had been attacked. The Osage insisted they were not responsible. Some believed the death was caused by an accident or an animal, while others whispered that rival tribes passed through the region that season. But in the fragile environment of the frontier, uncertainty only breeds more fear. The community buried the man in a small clearing, and neighbors stayed awake for long nights afterward, listening for sounds that might signal danger. This first death, though still wrapped in mystery, changed everything. It pushed the hidden tension of Center Creek out of the shadows and into the daily lives of those who live there. No longer were suspicious sounds dismissed. No longer were footprints in the mud considered harmless. The settlers tightened their circles, built stronger fences, sharpened their tools. The Osage, sensing the shift, moved with even greater stealth through the woods, unsure whether they themselves might be targeted. The balance, already delicate, began to tilt, and once a balance tips, it rarely returns to where it stood. The clearing where the hunter was found soon became a quiet place, avoided by many. Grass grew quickly over the disturbed soil, and the forest seemed eager to reclaim the spot. Yet if you stand there today, and some still do, you might feel the weight of that moment lingering like a breath held too long. Trampled grass, broken branches, a single life ended in a world that had already seen too much struggle. These small details, though muted by time, speak softly to those who listen. And as we leave that clearing behind, the breeze carries the faintest rustle, as if someone or something were moving just out of sight, investigating what was left behind. That same rustle becomes the step of a man approaching the clearing, his figure bending over something half hidden in the brush. The figure bending over the brush lifts the broken twigs, slowly, as though he already fears what he will find beneath them. The woods around him are still, too still, as if the trees themselves are holding their breath. In times like these, silence is not an absence of sound but a presence of warning, and every rustle beneath the leaves becomes a message. The search party behind him waits at a respectful distance, each man gripping his rifle with a tightened hand, each eye fixed on the small patch of disturbed earth where the missing hunters were last believed to have passed. It is early morning, though the canopy filters the light so deeply that dawn seems reluctant to reach the forest floor. Center Creek murmurs faintly somewhere to the east, but its voice is muted by distance and dread. And in this dim, heavy hour, the men searching for their neighbors begin to understand the weight of uncertainty that has pressed on these hills all summer long. The hunters they search for were not reckless men. They knew these trails better than most, had walked them since childhood, and understood the dangers well enough not to take unnecessary risks. They left the settlement with the easy confidence born of long experience, 2 of them carrying bows in addition to rifles, all of them carrying small sacks of dried meat and cornmeal, expecting to return within a day or 2 with game enough to feed several families. When they failed to return by sundown, their neighbors reassured one another that the woods can delay even the most capable men. Game may have drawn them deep into the ridges. Weather may have slowed them. A simple detour might have added hours. But as another day passed, and then a third, that reassurance frayed, thinning like a rope pulled too tight. The search party first followed the hunters' usual route along Center Creek, past the low rock shelf where they often checked for fresh tracks. They found signs of their passing, boot prints in soft soil, a broken stem, a bit of charred wood near a campsite. But beyond that, the trail splintered into confusion. A storm had blown through 2 nights earlier, smearing tracks and muddying the ground. The searchers pressed deeper, fanning out cautiously, calling the men's names into the trees, though they suspected no friendly answer would come. And now, in this quiet clearing where one man kneels over a bent shrub, they fear they have found something that cannot be undone. He pushes aside the brush. The others inch closer, reluctant but compelled. At first, all they see is a piece of cloth, dark, torn, streaked with mud, then the shape of a torn pack strap, a snapped arrow shaft, and finally, the unmistakable imprint of a struggle. Gouges in the earth, crushed leaves, a dark stain that speaks of injury. The men stand frozen, unsure whether to call out or move forward. The reality of what they are seeing settles over them with the slow, suffocating weight of understanding. Whatever happened here happened with violence. And the hunters, those familiar men with quiet manners and steady hands, had not simply lost their way. The oldest man in the group steps forward and crouches beside the disturbed earth. He touches the torn fabric and nods grimly. The piece belongs to one of the missing hunters. There is no doubt. The men exchange looks heavy with fear and anger, their silence as sharp as any spoken accusation. Some glance instinctively toward the deeper woods, imagining eyes watching from behind the thick undergrowth. Others scan the ground for tracks, though the rain has washed most signs into a muddled patchwork. Only faint impressions remain, uncertain, partial, suggesting movement in several directions. One man believes he sees the outline of a moccasin print near the edge of the clearing. Another insists it is only the distorted mark of a boot. No one can say for certain. But certainty, in moments like these, is often shaped less by evidence than by fear. And fear now whispers the same name over and over again, Osage. Though nothing in the clearing confirms this conclusion, the men repeat it quietly among themselves. They conjure the stories heard over the past months, scouts in the woods, arrows found near campsites, distant figures watching from ridgelines. They recall the first death along Center Creek, still unsolved, but accepted by many as a sign of escalating danger. They remember the widening sense of vulnerability that settled over their families with each passing week. In this frame of mind, the clearing becomes more than a site of struggle. It becomes a symbol of the war trail swallowing men whole. Yet truth is always more tangled than fear allows. The Osage, though often blamed, were not the only group passing through these hills. Smaller bands from other nations sometimes traveled the same hunting grounds. Stray traders and desperate wanderers cut across the creek without leaving names or origins. Even wild predators could leave signs mistaken for human conflict. The search party knows, somewhere beneath their rising anger, that the forest holds more possibilities than they can easily judge. But the mind, when wounded by uncertainty, often seeks the nearest shape into which it can pour its dread. They widen their search, spreading out from the clearing in deliberate lines. One man moves toward a thicket where the ground dips sharply, following a faint drag mark. Another circles the base of a sycamore, scanning for broken branches or snapped twigs. The man who found the torn cloth traces the pattern of the struggle, trying to piece together a sequence of events. Perhaps the hunters were ambushed, perhaps they ran, perhaps they were forced toward the creek. But without bodies, without weapons, without clear tracks, the truth remains a shadow flickering at the edge of the mind. Hours pass in this grim work. The sun climbs but adds little warmth to the dread soaked into the clearing. Birds return hesitantly to their branches, their calls seeming distant, mismatched to the men's grim expressions. When at last the searchers regroup, they carry little more than fragments, scraps of cloth, a broken arrow, a few scattered belongings, no bodies, no clear sign of what became of the hunters, only the undeniable evidence that something violent unfolded in this secluded pocket of the woods. They agree to press on toward a ravine that leads closer to Center Creek, but before leaving, the oldest man remains a moment longer at the clearing's edge. He looks down at the trampled earth, then up toward the ridgeline where the trees stand dark and silent. A thought crosses his face. Quiet, uncertain, heavy. It is the knowledge that whatever befell their neighbors did not end here. Something moved beyond this clearing, carrying the outcome of that struggle deeper into the woods. When he at last turns to follow the others, a faint glint catches his eye. Something half buried at the base of a fallen log. He kneels again, brushing away dirt and leaves. It is small, metallic, something personal enough to freeze him in place. The light catching its surface seems to flicker like the lantern back at the settlement, trembling against the shadow. He lifts it slowly into view, and the forest seems to hold still once more as the truth of the object settles into his hands. The object in his hand is a simple thing, just a metal buckle, worn smooth by years of use, dull at the edges where it once scraped against a belt strap. But simple things carry the deepest weight when they belong to someone known, someone expected to return home by supper time. The man holds it between his fingers for a long moment, his breath drawn tight as he recognizes it as belonging to one of the missing hunters, a neighbor he had spoken to only 3 days earlier. A good man, quiet, careful, the sort who checked his traps twice and never wandered far without marking his path. The buckle had been part of his gear for as long as anyone could remember, and now here it lies, half buried at the edge of a clearing marked by struggle. The others gather around, their faces drawn and pale. The fear they carried before was scattered and shapeless, but this small buckle condenses it into something hard and unavoidable. They know now that the hunters did not simply lose their way. Something drove them through this clearing, something that left signs of violence without leaving a body behind. The absence becomes more haunting than any discovery of remains might have been. It suggests pursuit, capture, or flight, any of which could have carried the men deeper into the unbroken woods. And so the searchers follow the faint traces leading down towards Center Creek, where the land dips, narrows, and offers fewer answers than questions. The descent is uneasy. Roots twist underfoot, and the men move slowly, each listening for sounds beyond their own footsteps. Sharp-eyed among them notice a broken branch here, a dent in soft earth there, but nothing clear enough to build a full picture. When they reach the lower ground where the ravine splits, they fan out once more. The oldest man, still gripping the buckle, feels a cold pull toward the creek itself, as if the water carries the truth downstream like a whispered confession. At the edge of the bank, the tracks smear into mud. Something, perhaps a body, perhaps a struggle, has churned the ground where the roots of an old willow reach into the water, but the creek's steady flow has erased the rest. They search along both banks for nearly an hour before one of the younger men calls out sharply. The voice is strained, not a shout of triumph, but of alarm. When the others reach him, he is standing beside a tangle of driftwood caught near a fallen sycamore trunk. There, partially hidden beneath branches and mud, lies another fragment of the hunter's belongings, a torn sleeve, faint traces of blood, and what appears to be the wooden haft of a broken tool. The items are pulled gently from the tangle. The men brace themselves for worse, but again the creek gives only remnants, never the whole truth. It is then that they sense something more, a presence. Not a person, not a sound, but the knowledge that they are not alone. The woods on the opposite bank are impossibly still. No bird call, no insect hum. Even the wind seems to bypass the trees entirely. The men feel watched, though none can say from where. One of them whispers that he sees a figure between the trunks, a tall shape, motionless. But when the others look, the place is empty except for shadows layered on shadows. The settlers are not the only ones who have come this far. Osage hunters often traveled along the creek, their paths older than the cabins scattered through these hills. It is entirely possible that an Osage band passed through earlier that morning, or even moments before. To them, these woods were a familiar corridor, one they moved through with practiced quiet. Whether they witnessed the struggle or arrived after, no settler could know. But the impression of being observed lingers, tightening around the men like an unseen hand. They retreat from the bank and regroup in the clearing above, each man carrying fragments of fear and speculation. Voices rise in low, tense debate. Some argue that the hunters must still be alive, taken captive, perhaps being held for reasons unknown. Others insist that the scene speaks of death, not capture. A few cling to the hope that the men escaped the initial conflict and are wandering injured somewhere deeper in the timber. Yet beneath all of these theories runs a single current. Someone, or some group, confronted the hunters with force. The return to the settlement is long and heavy. Word travels before the search party even arrives. Neighbors gather in uneasy clusters, watching the men approach with faces already braced for the news. When the torn belongings and buckle are shown, the weight of understanding falls over the entire community. Women draw their children closer. Men exchange glances darkened by resolve. A few whisper the word no one wants to say aloud, fearing that naming it will give it power. Osage. The conclusion, though unproven, begins shaping itself into certainty, yet the truth remains tangled. Some settlers point to the broken arrow, insisting it proves the hunters were attacked. Others remind them that arrows were traded widely among tribes and even among settlers themselves. A few voices, usually older, quieter men, try to suggest patience, arguing that the woods do not reveal their secrets quickly. But fear, once given momentum, is difficult to steady. As night settles over the settlement, a watch is organized. Lamps stay lit longer than usual. Rifles rest loaded near doors. Mothers hush their children early, hoping sleep will quiet their own racing thoughts. Outside, the hills darken into shapes that seem almost alive, shifting with the restless wind. The creek, its voice barely audible, continues its journey through the timber, indifferent to the turmoil unfolding around it. In one cabin, the oldest searcher sits alone at his table, the buckle lying between his hands. He turns it slowly, studying the worn edges, the faint scratches, the memory of the man who once fastened it every morning before stepping into the world. He thinks of the clearing, the disturbed earth, the torn belongings, the silence that pressed so heavily upon the trees, and as he closes his hand around the buckle, he senses that the truth has not yet fully revealed itself. Outside his window, something moves, not the shape of a person, not the stride of an animal, but the subtle shift of branches bending under a weight that passes without form. It leaves the trees trembling in its wake, as though carrying news the hills themselves do not wish to hear. And down along Center Creek, the drifting waters lap against something nestled in the mud, something small and unmistakably human, waiting to be found with the first pale light of dawn. The first pale light of dawn slips between the sycamores and settles across Center Creek in a thin, wavering sheet. It touches the mud along the bank, glints off the water's slow surface, and finally reaches the small object half buried at the edge of the shallows. When the searchers return, driven by dread, determination, and the knowledge that the creek holds answers too heavy to ignore, they find it exactly where the dark had left it: a hat, or what remains of one. Its brim is crushed, its crown torn, the fabric stained with mud and something darker. Not the buckle of yesterday, small enough to hold doubt. This is unmistakable. One of the missing hunters had worn it every day of his adult life, a familiar shape recognized by all who knew him. The sight of it, lying alone at the water's edge, removes any last veil of hopeful uncertainty. The men stand in a somber semicircle, staring at the hat without speaking. The creek gurgles softly, as though commenting in its own ancient way. The forest behind them waits motionless. Time itself seems to gather in the hollow of this discovery. A torn hat means violence. It means a struggle carried too far. It means that whatever happened in the clearing was only the beginning. For while the hat is here, the man who wore it is not. A single belonging can be mislaid. Two can be coincidence. But the drift of personal items scattered across the creek's path forms a trail of dread. The men understand that the story they have entered is no longer the story of lost hunters. It is the story of something darker, pulling at the region's fragile peace. They recover the hat carefully, as though it were a relic. No body remains nearby, though the churned mud suggests one may have passed through the water. The search widens again, this time with urgency. They spread along both banks, calling names more loudly, more insistently, though each man fears what might answer or what might remain silent. They move upstream, then down, probing the shallows with sticks, scanning the eddies beneath fallen branches. The creek, obedient to none of their fears, continues its slow winding around obstacles, shedding light in wavering reflections that reveal nothing more. By midday, exhaustion begins to take hold. A few men sit on exposed roots, staring blankly at the water. Others continue searching with grim resolve. The oldest among them, he who found the buckle, watches the trees instead. His instincts, honed over decades in these hills, tell him the truth rarely lies in the direction people expect. The water covers, erases, carries away. The woods, however, remember. He studies the shadows deeper in the timber, the undergrowth thick as woven cloth, the places where a man could vanish without leaving so much as a broken leaf. And he wonders whether the creek is not simply the place where the story ends, but the place where it was meant to be found, carried downstream by the force of someone else's decision. Rumors crackle through the settlement before the searchers even return that evening. Children sent to fetch water overhear the first whispers, a hat found by the creek, torn and stained. By the time the men emerge from the woods, the whispers have grown into a low, steady hum of fear. Women gather in doorways, pressing hands to their mouths. Men stand rigid, waiting for confirmation of what they already suspect. The news spreads through the small collection of cabins like smoke. No body, only the torn hat. An absence more chilling than a grim discovery. And with that absence comes a shift, subtle but unmistakable. What had been anxiety becomes quiet panic. What had been suspicion becomes conviction. The word Osage begins to circulate again, softly at first, then more firmly, spoken by those who already believed it, repeated by those who simply needed someone to blame. But even among the most fearful voices, a deeper question murmurs beneath. Not just who did this, but why the creek releases only fragments. Why does the land reveal the edges of violence while concealing its heart? Night falls with a tremor. Lamps burn later than usual. Dogs growl at shadows they cannot place. A few men take to patrolling the cabins, rifles in hand, watching the timberline for movement. Farther out, the woods stand still, thickening the darkness with their heavy silence. Nature holds its breath, and the people of Center Creek hold theirs with it. In one cabin, a widow who lost a son to fever years before sits by the fire, turning the recovered hat over in her hands. Her husband had known the missing hunters. They had shared harvest labor, exchanged tools, hunted together in lean winters. She feels the weight of their loss before the truth even fully arrives. The hat, still damp from the creek's edge, leaves faint smudges on her fingers. She closes her eyes and murmurs a prayer, not only for the lost men, but for the bitter shape this violence will carve into the community. Elsewhere, two young boys whisper in their shared loft bed. One claims he heard voices outside, low and rhythmic. The other insists it was only the wind. But they both remember the stories told by elders about Osage warriors moving silently through the woods, appearing without warning, vanishing without trace. The boys are afraid, though neither admits it aloud. Fear in children often finds its form through stories they only half understand. The next morning, more men gather, openly armed this time. They argue about whether to continue searching or prepare to defend the settlement from what they believe is coming. Some insist the hunters may still be alive, and that leaving them in the woods now would be a dishonor. Others argue that whatever happened at the creek was final. They speak in low voices of retaliation, of warning shots, of drawing lines. Their fear now seeks direction, purpose, action. But among them stands the oldest man, quiet and watchful. He raises the hat and speaks softly, reminding the group that the land is not speaking clearly, that no one has seen an Osage warrior act with hostility in this area for months, that the torn belongings, scattered from clearing to creek, could mean many things: flight, pursuit, even an encounter with someone other than those assumed. He urges caution, patience, a fuller truth. Yet fearful minds rarely choose patience. The others, hearts pounding with a need for certainty, push forward with their assumptions. Their voices grow louder. The oldest man grows quieter, and the creek, in its steady flow, refuses to reveal more. But memory, like water, carries messages long after the moment has passed. And while the settlers debate their next step, the Osage, too, begin speaking of the events along Center Creek, though not with the certainty the settlers imagine. They share questions of their own, murmured among hunting parties and families, forced into tighter and tighter quarters as the world changes around them. These murmurs cross into the next generation. Children hear them at night, whispered around fires that burn low. Women pass the stories in fragments, their voices soft, shadowed by doubt. Elders recall the days when Center Creek was their own quiet corridor, a place of gathering and passage. And slowly, the story of the missing hunters enters Osage memory as well, but in a form far different from the one held by the settlers. For them, Center Creek becomes a place of danger too, an area where the balance between people and land wavered, and a shadow crossing the water meant nothing good. Years later, descendants on both sides will tell their versions. Some will describe warriors emerging from the woods, fierce and silent. Others will claim the settlers provoked conflict through misunderstanding or trespass. But the truth, like the creek itself, runs between them, often hidden beneath the shifting silt of time. and somewhere along this long thread of retellings, a mother's voice will lower to a whisper as she tells her child how the story began, leaving out just enough detail to let the darkness settle between the words. That whisper hangs in the air now, drifting like smoke toward the next chapter. The whisper that drifted from mother to child, softened by grief and shaped by fear, does not fade as the years pass. Instead, it settles into the corners of memory, lodging itself within the rhythm of daily life along Center Creek. People begin repeating the story not as a fresh wound, but as something inherited, something carried like an heirloom no one asked for, but no one dares to discard. And with each retelling, whether around a hearth at the edge of a field or beneath the shade of an old walnut tree, the story gains another thin layer of meaning. Not invention, not embellishment, simply the natural drift of human memory across time. The years that followed the tragedy did not bring clarity, only distance. Children who once watched their fathers pace along the tree line with rifles grew into adults who remembered only the shape of those nights, not the full truth. They recalled the tightness in their mothers' voices, the hush that fell over the settlement when dusk approached, the lamp flames burning longer, trembling as though sensing what the people feared. They remembered the murmuring of men as they gathered to talk in low voices outside the cabins, their own names spoken softly as they were urged to stay inside until the sun rose again. And though these children did not witness the violence at Center Creek directly, they absorbed its shadow. That shadow deepened within them, later emerging in the stories they told their own children, stories meant to warn but often doing more to haunt. Center Creek itself changed slowly during these years. The land reclaimed the clearing where the hunters' belongings had been found, moss knitting over old disturbances, the soil smoothing into the natural unevenness of the forest floor. The creek's banks, once churned with mud and unease, grew thick with reeds. Saplings rose where search parties once stood. Yet even as the land healed, the memory did not. The people who lived near the creek still spoke of the missing hunters, though the details grew less precise with each passing season. A neighbor who once believed the men were taken captive now wondered if they were killed at the clearing. A woman who recalled hearing distant cries one night no longer trusted her own memory. Children repeated phrases overheard from elders, phrases they did not understand, but repeated with the solemnity of ritual. Some descendants remembered the torn hat most vividly. They described it with a kind of awe, as though it had floated down the creek like a message from the dead. Others focused on the broken arrow shaft found in the struggle. Still others insisted that the clearing itself was haunted, claiming that the trees whispered at dusk if one stood quietly enough. Such beliefs, born of fear and grief, seeped into the region's consciousness. But beyond these fragments lay the deeper, more unsettling understanding that the truth had slipped from human hands long ago. During these years, the Osage were undergoing their own transformation, one far more painful, far more permanent. The forced removals, the shrinking of their homelands, the quiet but relentless push westward to the reservation lands in Kansas were not simply bureaucratic changes. They were ruptures, tearing families from ancestral grounds, severing the deep ties between people and place. Along Center Creek, Osage hunters and families had walked the trails for centuries. They knew the bends of the water, the hollows, the old trees struck by lightning generations before. Leaving such places was not merely relocation, it was the unmaking of memory. And yet, the Osage carried their own memories of the events near Center Creek, though very few of those accounts entered written record. In their recollections, those preserved in fragments or echoed faintly through oral tradition, the story was different from the settlers' version. Some Osage elders spoke of conflicts sparked by misunderstandings over hunting grounds. Others remembered a period of heightened fear, fueled by the approach of aggressive settlers and pressure from rival tribes. A few recalled that certain areas along the creek had become dangerous, not because of Osage warriors, but because of other groups moving through the region, seeking advantage amid the growing chaos. The Osage version of the story was marked not by triumph or savagery, but by sorrow, confusion, and the bitter taste of a world collapsing around them. These echoes rarely crossed into settler memory. Each community held its own grief too tightly to listen to the other. Yet over time, the two versions, though separated, began to intertwine in the subtle way that shared landscapes create shared fears. Families on both sides told stories of danger along Center Creek, of men who vanished, of footsteps in the woods that could not be traced. The logs of new cabins creaked under the weight of old stories. The wind that swept down the ravine carried whispers shaped by both cultures, and a strange inheritance took root in the soil, a sense that the land itself remembered what its people tried to forget. One of the most striking examples of this shared memory emerged years later from a child who had heard both settlers and Osage speak of the tragedy. She was the granddaughter of a frontier woman who lived near the creek, and the great-granddaughter of an Osage woman forced west by the treaties. As an elderly woman herself, she recalled sitting by a fire in Kansas, listening to her Osage relatives speak in soft tones about the dangers that had once lurked along the water. She remembered returning to the Ozarks as a young adult and hearing settlers speak with the same unease, the same hesitation, the same lowering of the voice when describing the woods at twilight. Two communities, long estranged, carried different stories, yet both carried the same lingering fear. This blending of memory, though subtle, created something enduring. It shaped the way people walked along the creek at dusk. It colored the way children understood danger. It influenced the way elders chose their words when speaking of the past. And in these shared shadows, something timeless settled, a tension that outlived the original violence. Even now, old-timers in the region speak of Center Creek with a certain tone. They do not recount the story with dramatic flourishes or certainty. Instead, they pause, gaze into the distance, and speak slowly, as though they are touching something fragile. Many still claim that the woods hold echoes. Some say they have heard faint cries on nights when fog clings to the water. Others insist that silhouettes sometimes appear along the ridgeline, tall and still, watching in silence just as they were said to have done generations before. But most telling of all is the way they lower their voices when they reach the part of the tale that touches the beheading, the detail that later became the core of the legend. None of them agree on the facts. None can cite a record that captures it clearly. Yet the story persists, floating between history and folklore, shaped by grief and sharpened by fear. And so the whisper that has traveled through decades becomes part of something larger. It drifts from family to family, riding on breath and memory. It lingers in the hollows and the bends of the creek. It settles into the soil, joins the roots, threads itself through the ridges. And in time, it grows into the kind of shadow that can no longer be dismissed, only acknowledged, respected, and passed on. A mother's voice lowers again, passing the story to her child, and as she does, the whisper seems to drift beyond the walls of the cabin, slipping into the woods where the old trees wait with patience, ready to carry it into the realm of legend. That whisper becomes the glow of a campfire beneath those trees, its crackling embers holding the next telling of the story, a version shaped not by fact alone, but by the slow drift of memory into myth. The campfire's glow flickers against the trunks of the old trees, casting long, distorted shapes that sway with the breeze. A half circle of figures sits around the fire, some young, some old, listening as the story shifts, softens, and lengthens the way tales do when they pass into the deeper realm of memory. Here, in the hush between flame crackle and night wind, truth begins to fold into legend, not with deceit, but with the same inevitability that water bends a shoreline over generations. A story told enough times becomes shaped not only by what happened, but by how it was felt. and the story of the beheading at Center Creek, once rooted in fragmented facts and broken belongings, slowly grows into one of the most enduring and troubling frontier legends of the Ozarks. Around this campfire, whether real or imagined, yesterday or a century ago, the teller begins with the familiar pieces: the missing hunters, the torn hat found by the creek, the buckle recovered from the clearing, the scattered prints and broken arrow. But with each repetition through the years, details drift. Some sharpen, others fade, and still others change shape entirely. By the time the tale reaches its listeners here, gathered in the glow of low flames, it is no longer the story of a disappearance. It is a story of confrontation, battle, and a moment so violent it carved itself into the psyche of a region. One version claims that the hunters were ambushed near the ravine, surrounded by Osage warriors moving silently through the brush. The tale says they fought with rifles and knives until their ammunition ran dry. It claims that one man fled toward the creek, only to be overtaken and killed before he reached the water. Another version asserts that the men were captured, tied to trees, and interrogated for trespassing on Osage hunting grounds. That version insists the beheading was not born from savagery, but from a ritual of war. An act not meant purely to kill, but to send a message of ownership and defiance. Then there is the darker, more vivid telling, often whispered when children are supposed to be asleep. In that one, the men were found days later, or perhaps only one of them, lying in the shallows of Center Creek with his head severed and missing. This version claims the creek ran red, that the water carried the story farther than any person could. It says the head was taken as a trophy, a warning, a grim symbol of the growing war between settlers and the Osage. Yet no record from the era confirms such dramatic details. No coroner's report, no government ledger, only the oral accounts passed down decades apart, carrying fragments and shadows of something that may have happened in a less clear, less gruesome way. Still, the beheading story persisted. It persisted because it frightened. It persisted because it answered the settlers' need to make sense of the hunter's disappearance. And it persisted because the violent image of a man found headless or entirely vanished burns itself into the imagination far more deeply than a story of simple death. But even as settlers built this legend, creating a narrative where the Osage were the unquestioned aggressors, the Osage themselves carried a different memory of the same season. In their accounts, passed through families and clans but rarely written down, the conflict along Center Creek was not a premeditated act of brutality. It was a flare of violence rooted in fear, hunger, and confusion as their world collapsed under the weight of forced removal. Some remembered hearing of a confrontation with white hunters who had wandered too far into restricted grounds. Others recalled finding the remains of a struggle they believed had been caused by rival tribes or rogue individuals. A few older voices insisted that the Osage were blamed for acts they did not commit, their reputation twisted by panic and prejudice. This split in memory created something strange. Two communities who both carried fear, both carried grief, and both told stories designed to explain a period of chaos neither fully understood. And what grew between these communities was not resolution, but a mythic divide. One side seeing the story as proof of Osage savagery, the other seeing it as part of the greater injustice inflicted upon their people. As the decades passed, reality and legend began to fuse. The written accounts that survive, mainly frontier diaries, local histories, and secondhand newspaper pieces from later years, reflect the same mixture of doubt and conviction. Some state plainly that a man was found beheaded along Center Creek, calling it one of the most brutal frontier killings in local memory. Others hedge their claims, noting only that one man's fate was terrible, or that his remains bore signs of mutilation. A few dismiss the entire story as misremembered or exaggerated, stating that the bodies were never found at all. In these conflicting accounts lies the clearest evidence that truth had already begun to slip from human grasp long before the tale reached its first campfire. But the Ozarks, with their deep hollows and watchful hills, have always been fertile ground for stories that sit between worlds. These mountains and valleys hold onto shadows longer than they hold onto facts. A fog rolling through Center Creek at dawn looks the same today as it did 200 years ago. A coyote howl echoing across the timberline still raises hair on the back of the neck, whether the listener is a child in the 21st century or an Osage hunter in the 18th. And the sense of being watched in these woods, the awareness of invisible presence, remains as vivid now as it was for the settlers who believed warriors waited behind every tree. So the legend of the beheading became part of the region's identity. It seeped into the way people spoke of danger. It colored the language of caution parents used with their children. It settled into schoolyard tales and fireside warnings. It accompanied hunters into the woods, whispered in the back of the mind when they walked too far from the trail. Even those who doubted the graphic detail of the tale still felt its weight. They still spoke of Center Creek as a place where something terrible happened, a thing half hidden, half revealed, never confirmed, but never forgotten. And in time, the legend took on a strange life of its own. Some storytellers shifted the blame away from the Osage entirely, claiming the deed was committed by a band of renegades passing through the region. Others insisted the act was performed by settlers themselves in retaliation for an earlier grievance, the truth buried to avoid scandal. A few wove supernatural elements into the tale, suggesting that the beheading was not the work of any human hand at all, but a curse placed upon the land after too much blood had been spilled. Yet for all these variations, the core remained the same. Men went into the woods and never returned, and the land along Center Creek absorbed their fate into its ancient memory. Around the campfire, the storyteller pauses. The flames crackle softly. Someone pokes at the coals, sending a shower of sparks drifting upward like lost fireflies. The night around them seems to lean in, listening. Then the teller resumes, voice quieter now, as though the next part of the story must be delivered carefully. Every tale, they say, grows in the telling. But some tales, especially the dark ones, grow in the listening. And when the fire's last ember dims, the story hangs in the air like smoke, slowly drifting toward the next person who will carry it forward. That crackling ember glows once more, casting its faint light on a figure beside the fire, someone about to speak from the other side of the memory, their perspective shaped by a completely different truth. The ember glows faintly, shifting from orange to red as it settles deeper into the ash. Beside the fire, a figure leans forward, a man with lines carved into his face not by age alone, but by memory carried farther than he ever wished to bear. He does not tell his story loudly, he does not need to. His voice has the steady weight of someone who has seen the world break open and rearrange itself in ways the young around him cannot yet imagine. And as he begins to speak, the others fall silent. For this is the rarest part of the tale, the Osage memory of the years when Center Creek was becoming a place of shadows, accusation, and loss. He begins not with the settlers or their vanished hunters, but with the land that shaped his people long before the first cabin roof rose along the creek. He speaks of an older era when the Osage walked freely, when trails crossed the hills like veins, when families camped near the water during seasonal hunts. In his telling, Center Creek was not a border or a place of tension, but a gathering place, a quiet corridor where men fished at night while women tended fires along the bank. To him, the land is not a backdrop, but a living memory, one that remembers both kindness and violence equally. Then his voice shifts, growing softer, He recalls the early years of removal, when word of treaties reached the villages like storms that arrive with no thunder, sudden, cold, and demanding. He remembers how elders spoke of the land shrinking beneath their feet, how the villages grew tense, how hunters returned with less and less game. He remembers the confusion, the anger, but most of all the helplessness as new faces appeared in the hills. White settlers who spoke with conviction about ownership, but knew nothing of the trails, the spirits, the histories woven into the Ozark Plateau. In this part of his story, he does not cast blame. He describes a collision of worlds, each convinced of its own certainty. Settlers believed the land was theirs by promise of distant governments. Osage families believed the land was theirs because it had been home since time uncounted. The man beside the fire says that in those years, every path felt crowded by ghosts of the future, ghosts of people not yet born who would inherit the consequences of choices made in fear. Someone asks him, quietly, respectfully, what he remembers hearing about the incident at Center Creek. He closes his eyes for a moment, pressed by the weight of memory. When he opens them again, the firelight catches the years in his gaze. He says that he never learned the full truth, not from the elders, not from the hunters, not from the families who lived through that time. But he remembers a story passed among Osage hunters, the story of encountering a clearing disturbed by violence. They found markings on the ground, bent branches, churned soil, evidence of men in desperate motion. They found blood, less than expected but unmistakable. And they found tracks leading away in several directions, suggesting confusion, perhaps more than one group involved. But what they did not find was ownership of the act. No Osage warrior claimed responsibility. No clan carried the story with pride or sorrow, as would have been customary if their people had been involved in a confrontation of such magnitude. The man beside the fire explains that when Osage warriors engaged in battle or defense, the stories, bitter or triumphant, were preserved with specificity. Names, reasons, debts owed, lessons learned. Silence, in this case, meant uncertainty. Yet something had happened. Everyone felt it, and in the absence of clarity, rumor filled the void. He remembers elders speculating that another group, perhaps a roaming band displaced from the north, or individuals acting outside tribal custom, might have clashed with the settlers' hunters. He remembers warnings passed quietly among Osage families. Avoid Center Creek for a time. Something dark has unsettled the land. He remembers hearing, as a child, that the spirits along the creek were restless, that something had been taken before its time, something that left the trees unwilling to speak. Still, even among the Osage, the legend of the missing settler heads took shape, but in ways different from the settlers' version. In the Osage telling, the beheading was not a trophy or ritual act. Instead, it was a symbol of imbalance, an act out of step with the natural order. It signaled that the hills had become a place of confusion, that the world was being pushed into a shape it was never meant to hold. For them, the story was not about dominance or victory, but about a rupture in the harmony between people and land. The man beside the campfire explains that the most sorrowful part of the tale for the Osage was not the violence itself, but the way it became a permanent marker in the settlers' minds. Another stone added to the weight of misunderstanding. He says the Osage carried grief too. They lost hunters to settler bullets. They lost children to starvation after treaties failed them. They lost elders who could not bear the uprooting. Their grief, however, was often invisible to those who saw only warriors and weapons, never women, never families gathered around dying fires, never the way a community holds itself together when its roots are severed. He speaks of a time when an Osage searching party came close to encountering the settlers' search party along the creek. The two groups sensed one another, but never met face to face. If they had, he wonders aloud, would violence have erupted, or would truth have been spoken? No one knows. Silence separated them then. Silence separates the histories now. As he continues, the fire burns lower. Sparks drift upward, catching briefly in the branches before disappearing into the night. The listeners lean closer, not wanting to lose a single word. The man describes the moment generations later when he walked the old trails near Center Creek with his own grandmother. She told him to listen, to the birds, to the wind, to the absence of certain sounds. She told him the land never lies, but people often misunderstand what the land says. She told him to be wary of stories that come too easily, too firmly, too loudly. Truth, she said, rarely raises its voice. He pauses and the night breathes with him. Then he says that the settler's story of the beheading was not wrong, only incomplete. The Osage memory was not correct, only limited. What happened at Center Creek was shaped by fear on both sides, by hunger, by dispossession, by desperation, by mistakes in judgment, by the long, slow collapse of a world that had once been balanced. And when a world collapses, he says, it leaves behind broken pieces people try to arrange into stories that make sense. The fire pops, releasing a shower of sparks. The listeners blink at the sudden flash. When they look back at the man, he has grown quiet again, his thoughts drifting like embers settling into ash. But as his voice fades, a new question rises among those gathered, a question formed not of fear, but of understanding. How many truths were buried beneath the noise of legend? That question settles into the embers, glowing faintly as the fire continues to dim. And in the faint glow of those embers lies the beginning of a broader understanding, one that will widen into the turbulent history of a region shaped by conflict, misinterpretation, and the long struggle to survive. Beyond the fire's edge, the dark stirs once more, and the next chapter waits in the shifting shadow of a war club laid quietly across a grave. The war club rests across the grave like a final sentence left unfinished, its curved shadow stretching over the mound of earth as the last light of day withdraws from the hills. In the fading glow, the wood appears older than it is, worn smooth not only by the hands that carried it, but by the memory of a people whose world had been upended. The Osage once placed such clubs across the resting places of warriors, not as symbols of victory, but as acknowledgments of burdens carried, battles weathered, and a life that walked the hard path between duty and survival. Now, in this moment, that war club serves as a bridge between two histories, the memory we heard beside the campfire and the broader truth that shaped the turmoil surrounding Center Creek. The quiet around the grave deepens, and it is from that quiet that we step backward once more, widening our lens beyond the tragedy of the missing hunters, beyond the whispered beheading, beyond the legend that grew like thistle along the banks of the creek. To understand the conflict fully, we must look beyond Center Creek and into the larger world pressing in from every direction during the early 19th century. A world in which the Osage were not merely reacting to settlers, but to forces much greater and more chaotic than any one frontier family could imagine. The Osage, though often portrayed in settler accounts as aggressors, lived during these years with pressure closing in on all sides. To the west and south were enemy tribes who had long resented Osage dominance. To the north were groups displaced by war and forced migrations, people pushed into territories they did not know, hungry, desperate, and armed. And to the east were the Americans, whose expanding settlements choked traditional hunting grounds and disrupted ancient patterns of movement. Every trail became contested, every valley became contested, every river bend, every hollow, every flat of open land became a place where tension gathered like thunderheads before a storm. This misunderstanding of the broader context is one of the reasons the Center Creek story evolved into the legend it became. Settlers who found scraps of cloth, broken arrows, and a torn hat had no way to see the full picture. They did not know the Osage were themselves fighting to survive. They did not know rival tribes sometimes crossed Osage trails seeking vengeance. They did not know starving bands of displaced people, tribal and non-tribal alike, roamed the land in search of whatever they could take. To settlers who barely understood the language of the hills, every violent shape became an Osage shadow. Every missing man became an Osage attack, and thus the war trail through the Ozarks took on a sharper, harsher outline. But the truth is more complicated. While some conflicts certainly arose between Osage warriors and frontier settlers, many incidents attributed to the Osage were either misunderstandings or the work of entirely different groups. The Osage did not move through the woods recklessly. Their warriors were trained to observe, to measure danger, to avoid unnecessary conflict. They had families to protect, children to feed, elders to shelter. They had no reason to provoke war lightly. But when pushed, when hunting grounds were seized, when settlements encroached upon burial sites, when promises were broken, they responded with the force expected of proud sovereign people. At the same time, settlers living under constant fear were quick to interpret silence as threat. A glimpse of movement became a stalking warrior. A sound in the brush became a sign of ambush. Even the tall, powerful stature of Osage men became fuel for anxiety, foreign to people accustomed to smaller frames and quieter cultures. And so the space between misunderstanding and conflict narrowed dangerously. Throughout the 18 teens and 20s, skirmishes flared along the frontier. Not major battles, nothing like the Great Wars in the East, but sharp, localized eruptions of violence. A stolen horse here, a missing cow there, a traveler disappearing on the road between settlements. Sometimes the conflict was accidental, a settler crossing a trail at the wrong moment, an Osage hunting party startling a lone cabin resident. Other times, it was provoked by deeper wounds, retaliations for wrongs that began far from Center Creek but spilled into its quiet bends. As the man beside the campfire implied, the Osage were not insulated from loss. They buried their own dead during these years, men killed in ambushes, women caught in crossfire, children lost to hunger or exposure as the tribe was forced into increasingly unstable conditions. After the treaties of 1818 and 1825, the Osage relinquished millions of acres across Missouri and Arkansas, including land around the Ozark Plateau. The ceded territory was so vast that the numbers scarcely meant anything to the people on either side. What settlers saw as newly opened frontier, the Osage saw as the slow erasure of everything that anchored them. That erasure brought chaos. It changed how Osage warriors traveled. It changed how families moved across the land. It changed which trails were safe and which were shadows of their former selves. And as new groups, Delaware, Shawnee, Cherokee, Kickapoo, were relocated into the region, friction intensified between peoples long accustomed to distinct homelands. The frontier became a tangle of overlapping claims, each group struggling to maintain identity while being shoved into smaller and smaller spaces. In this volatile environment, the disappearance of the hunters along Center Creek was not an isolated story, but part of a larger pattern of conflict, displacement, and despair. A violent act could have come from anyone. A retaliatory strike could have been launched by any group suffering loss. A desperate person, native or settler, might have taken drastic measures when starvation loomed. Yet because the Osage were the longest standing and most visible power in the region, they bore the brunt of the blame, often without evidence. And so, two simultaneous truths evolved. In settler memory, the Osage were feared and seen as responsible for the darkest moments along the frontier. In Osage memory, the settlers were the force that tore apart a world and made violence more likely at every turn. Both sides carried grief. Both sides carried misunderstanding. Both sides carried their version of danger. As the war club rests across the grave, the man who placed it there might well have been mourning a warrior killed by settlers, something the settlers did not record. Or he might have mourned a man killed by rival tribes, a part of the story lost entirely to time. The grave could belong to someone connected directly to the Center Creek tragedy, or someone whose death shaped the fear that influenced how the story was later told. The war club, lying in silence, knows this truth, but people separated by culture and history did not. Here lies the heart of this chapter. No event along Center Creek happened in isolation. Every conflict was a thread woven into a larger tapestry of war, misunderstanding, survival, and loss. And before the beheading legend spread across the Ozarks like wildfire, there was this heavier, quieter truth beneath it. An entire world collapsing into conflict because two peoples, both desperate, stood on land neither was willing to relinquish. The storm building over the prairie horizon reflects that truth. Its clouds thicken, rolling with a slow violence that mirrors the era. The wind picks up, the trees lean, the war club trembles where it lies. And as the storm begins, its long approach, the next chapter opens with rain falling across the treaties and the roads that carried the Osage westward, away from a homeland that had shaped them for centuries. The first drops of rain fall like hesitant fingertips across the prairie, spreading outward in widening circles until the entire horizon darkens beneath the storm. It is the kind of rain that arrives not with violence, but with inevitability, a slow, steady unraveling of clarity into haze. And as the water gathers in shallow depressions along the hills, it becomes impossible not to imagine the treaties inked in distant halls, dissolving just as easily, their promises dripping away into the soil, while the people meant to live under them brace for the chill of another uprooted season. For the Osage, the storm that swept across their world was not a single moment, but a long, unbroken chain of losses, each one tightening around the heart of their nation until the land itself felt unfamiliar. In the 1820s and early 30s, the Ozark Plateau was transformed with a speed that defied comprehension. Settlers, lured by government assurances, cheap land, and the myth of endless opportunity, pushed into the valleys, ridges, and creekside flats where the Osage had farmed, hunted, and lived for generations untold. The treaties that forced these changes often read neat and orderly on paper, with their carefully measured boundaries and allocations. But in practice, they were blunt instruments, slicing through homelands with no understanding of the spiritual, familial, and historical ties that bound the people to the soil. The rain grows heavier now, blurring the contours of the hills and washing loose stones down the faint roads carved by wagon wheels. The same rain once fell on the Osage as they gathered their few belongings for the mandated move to Kansas, the so-called permanent Indian frontier that would, in a handful of decades, prove not permanent at all. They walked away from their homes along rivers and springs with the quiet dignity of people who have learned that grieving openly only feeds the hunger of those eager to take what they have left. Their villages emptied one by one, the fires going cold, the lodges collapsing under their own abandonment. Trails once alive with laughter and language grew silent, overgrown, waiting for feet that would never return. Along Center Creek, the changes were felt immediately. The trails the Osage once took from ridge to river vanished beneath the new geometry of settler roads. The burial mounds, those sacred places where generations rested, became shrubs and stones to the new eyes that found them. Groves used for councils and ceremonies were cut down for pasture. Springs where women once gathered water were fenced and named for the families who claimed the land. Even the creek itself acquired new meanings as the settlers tied their own history to it, speaking less of the people who came before and more of the cabin lines, the mills, the trading posts, and the tragedies they believed had begun the moment of their arrival. Yet despite the disappearance of the Osage presence, their absence carried its own haunting weight. The settlers often described a strange hollowness in the land, as though the hills themselves remembered the people who had shaped them. Some of the first churches built in the region hosted sermons that acknowledged, however briefly, the sorrow of those displaced. A few frontier families even questioned the fairness of the arrangements that had granted them their new property. but most, driven by fear or ignorance or simple relief at finally having a place to call their own, pushed such thoughts aside. The years that followed brought new waves of settlers, and with them came new conflicts unrelated to the Osage. Disputes between families over property lines, quarrels between communities about water rights, and the growing tension of the Civil War all reflected the shifting nature of the region. Meanwhile, the memory of the Osage lingered only as stories, some shaped by respect, others by resentment, and many by misunderstandings passed down through generations who never knew the people behind the narratives. But for those who remained near Center Creek long after the Osage had been forced west, the absence of an entire nation created a strange effect. Without their direct presence to confirm or challenge the stories told, the legend of the beheading and the broader conflict became easier to mold into the cultural fabric of the Ozarks. In a land where fact and folklore had always walked close together, the void left by the Osage allowed stories to develop unchecked, drifting deeper into myth. The creek became a place where shadows were not just shadows, and where silence carried echoes of a time most could no longer fully recall. And yet, not all memory faded into distortion. Some settlers, especially those who lived through the transitions, passed down quieter recollections, stories of Osage generosity, moments of shared labor, peaceful meetings along trails or rivers. A few old diaries, rarely cited, mention evenings when Osage and settler families exchanged food, or when an Osage hunter guided a lost child back to her cabin. These accounts rarely entered the dominant narrative, overshadowed by tales of violence and fear, but they persisted in pockets of family lore, surviving as faint reminders that the relationship between these communities was more complex, layered, and human than the bolder legends allowed. Still, a larger transformation was underway. As the Osage were pushed farther west, deeper into uncertainty, Center Creek began to acquire a new identity, one shaped not by the people who had lived there for centuries, but by those who came afterward. The creek became a geographical feature rather than a cultural artery. It became a place of farms, fords, fishing holes, and hidden corners where lovers carved initials into soft wood. But beneath these newer layers, the deeper story, the one tied to trails and memory and loss, remained embedded in the soil. And so, when an old-timer decades later walked along the creek and felt an inexplicable chill at the edge of dusk, he attributed it not to temperature, but to presence. When a hunter paused near the ravine and felt watched, he remembered his grandfather's tale of the missing men and the tension that filled the woods before the Osage were removed. When a mother warned her children not to wander too close to certain bends of the creek, she passed along the echo of fear inherited from her own grandmother, who had heard gunshots in the distance during those uncertain years. These half-memories created a strange paradox. The physical absence of the Osage made their spiritual presence more pronounced. The hills felt emptier, and the emptiness itself felt inhabited. People sensed the weight of untouched stories, the ones that remained buried beneath the louder, sharper tales of frontier violence. Over time, as new generations settled into the Ozarks, the land continued its slow transformation. But the stories persisted, rippling through families like a quiet undertow. The tale of the beheading became a centerpiece, a point around which fear, fascination, and sorrow revolved. People found themselves drawn to the mystery not because it was gruesome, but because it was incomplete. It left space for imagination, for caution, for wonder. It allowed the land itself to speak in its old cryptic way. And so the rain falling across the hills this evening feels much like the rain that fell on the day the Osage left, gentle but relentless, erasing footprints, softening trails, blurring the hard lines between past and present. The creek rises slowly beneath it, carrying silt and memory downstream, blending old water with new. But the next chapter does not belong to the past alone. It belongs to the way those old stories continue to shape the identity of Center Creek today. It belongs to the bridges and roads and quiet fields that now rest where villages once stood. It belongs to the people who walk the land with only a partial understanding of what lies beneath their feet. And in the quiet aftermath of the storm, the wind carries the faintest whisper of those earlier footsteps, leading us toward the modern creek that still holds the old shadows. The ripples cross the water now, faint and spreading, opening the way to the next chapter. The ripples that move across Center Creek do so with a kind of patient certainty, widening and softening as they drift downstream, as if carrying with them the last faint echoes of voices that once shaped this land. When the storm clears, the hills rise clean and sharp against the pale morning light, but the creek, always the creek, holds the aftertaste of everything that has passed through it. And in the decades after the Osage were forced away, the people who remained along Center Creek found themselves living in a landscape that felt strangely layered, as though every path, every bend of the water, every old tree root held more memory than it wished to reveal. The land had not forgotten. The people had. Or perhaps they had only half remembered. It is into this half memory that modern residents stepped, often without knowing it. The settlers' grandchildren grew up on farms carved from ground once walked by Osage women, gathering roots. Their children fished from the same pools where Osage boys once learned to spear trout. They built homesteads where old lodges had stood, unaware that beneath their cabins were trails older than any map in their possession. And in that way, Center Creek became a place where the living walked atop buried histories without ever fully sensing their weight, until the stories returned to them, carried not in fact, but in memory. By the late 19th century, the beheading tale had threaded itself deeply into local lore. It appeared in the margins of county histories, sometimes as a confirmed event, other times as a rumor repeated too often to ignore. Old men sitting outside general stores mentioned it in passing, sometimes mixing it with unrelated conflicts or misremembered wars. A few newspapers referenced the Center Creek incident, though no article ever provided more detail than what already circulated through oral accounts. The lack of specifics made the story more haunting, not less. When people cannot pin down a truth, they assign it a significance that grows in the empty spaces left behind. Walking along Center Creek today, one can still feel the shape of that old uncertainty, even if the land appears peaceful. The creek runs clear through a patchwork of private land and public access points. Sycamores lean over the water the same way they did 200 years ago. Limestone shelves jut into the current, forming pale ledges beneath which minnows flicker in loose clusters. On quiet afternoons, the only sounds are the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of insects. But old-timers who grew up near the creek, men and women now in their 70s and 80s, will tell you that certain places along the water never lost their reputation. They speak of bends where the air feels colder, of hollows where dogs refuse to enter, of nights when strange cries echo across the timber as though carried from far older conflicts. One farmer, recalling his childhood in the 1940s, remembered being warned not to swim near a particular spot in the creek after dusk. His grandmother told him that the water there kept secrets and that it was best not to disturb what lay beneath. He laughed at the idea then, imagining ghosts and headless figures. But years later, after raising his own children in the same hollow, he found that even he avoided the place at certain hours. "It's not that I believe in anything," he said. "It's just that the land feels like it does." Another story comes from a woman who grew up along an old wagon trace near the creek. She remembered walking to school in the early morning and feeling watched in the same place every time. She never saw anyone, never heard anything unusual, yet the sensation never left her. Decades later, she discovered that the trace had once followed the same path settlers used during the search for the missing hunters. "Maybe it's only imagination," she said, "but some places don't shake off history." Local historians began piecing together the fragmented accounts in the mid-20th century, combing through courthouse records, regional archives, and family papers. What they found confirmed parts of the story. There were indeed missing settlers in the early 19th century, unexplained disappearances, tensions with native groups, and vague mentions of mutilated remains. Yet the one detail that had endured most fully, the beheading, remained elusive. No formal document recorded it. No church ledger mentioned a body buried without a head, and no settler journal preserved an eyewitness account. What existed instead were hints, references, indirect lines that circled the story without ever touching its center. But folklore does not need documentation to survive. It only needs people who continue to believe the story matters. And along Center Creek, the story did matter. It mattered because it gave shape to fears people could not articulate. It mattered because it explained the unease that settled over the land after the Osage were removed. It mattered because it allowed the living to feel connected to a deeper, more mysterious past. Even skeptics admitted that something had happened along the creek, something serious enough to fracture memory, something solemn enough to leave its mark on the landscape long after the bodies were gone. In the later 20th century, as the Ozarks embraced tourism and heritage preservation, the legend found new life. It appeared in ghost tour scripts, in small pamphlets printed by local historical societies, in documentaries aired on local channels during regional history months. The story lost none of its gravity in these retellings. If anything, the focus on the truth versus legend debate made it more compelling. People wanted to know, was there really a beheading? Did the Osage truly commit the act? Or was the story twisted by fear and prejudice? Why did different families remember the event so differently? One historian noted that almost every version of the story places the settlers at the center and the Osage at the margins. But he argued that the reverse was equally possible, that the beheading was not the focal point of Osage memory at all, but a minor tragedy overshadowed by the immense trauma of removal. Perhaps the story is loud for one group and silent for the other, he wrote, but silence is not absence. Silence is another form of storytelling, one that settlers never learned how to hear. Yet despite decades of research, the truth remains suspended between the documented and the remembered. The modern landscape along Center Creek holds clues: an eroded stone where a cabin once stood, faint depressions marking old trails, a patch of ground where early settlers claimed they buried a man whose body they never recovered fully. But these clues are quiet. They do not confirm. They do not deny. They simply sit in the earth like all the other undecided stories the Ozarks have absorbed. This lingering uncertainty is why Center Creek continues to draw the curious. It is a place where the past feels strangely close, where the land itself seems to invite questions. Not questions of spectacle or horror, but questions of origins, of identity, of responsibility, of what stories mean when we inherit them without knowing how they were first shaped. For many who walk the creek today, the legend is not about violence. It is about remembrance, about the fragility of truth and the stubbornness of memory. As the creek settles into its evening quiet, fireflies rise among the reeds, blinking softly in the dimming light. Their glow reflects in the water, creating dozens of drifting points of pale gold. The scene is peaceful, almost tender, yet there is something beneath the surface, an old echo, an unresolved note. Modern memory can only trace its outline, not fill it in. And so the ripples that open this chapter spread outward once more, widening into the question that will carry us into the next. What do we truly know? And what do we only think we know? Those ripples fade under the rising moon, and its reflection opens the doorway to the next chapter, where truth and legend finally meet. The moon rises over Center Creek like a silver coin placed gently on the surface of the world, its reflection bending and swaying in the soft current. It does not sharpen the land the way the sun does, not here, not in these hills. Instead, it softens everything it touches. Shadows stretch, deepen, then blur, merging into shapes that seem to breathe along the timberline. It is beneath this moonlight, in this softened landscape suspended between clarity and darkness, that truth and legend finally brush against each other, neither fully yielding, neither fully stepping aside. And for those who have lived long enough to hear every version, this is where the heart of the story beats, with slow insistence, as though the land itself asks us to look once more, carefully, at what we think we know. Truth, after all, is not the steady pillar we often imagine. It shifts with the angle of the light. It changes with the teller. And nowhere is that more evident than in the legend of the beheading at Center Creek. When we stand at this point in the long journey of the story, gazing backward and forward across nearly 2 centuries, we begin to see not what happened, but why the region remembers it the way it does. The documented record offers very little. There are hints in local histories, fragments in early newspaper summaries, and scattered references in diaries. One settler account mentions a grievous and disfigured corpse found near the water. Another refers to evidence of butchery too severe for decent description, yet none mention a severed head explicitly. The closest any document comes is a cryptic sentence written by an early minister who traveled through Jasper County in the 1840s. In his journal, he noted, "The people speak still of the man found in so unnatural a state they feared to speak of it plainly." This single line has been treated by some as confirmation of the beheading. Others see it as exaggeration, filtered through the minister's own discomfort. It reveals a truth often overlooked. Early settlers sometimes avoided recording the most disturbing details of violent deaths. Their journals mention tragedy, not the shape of it. Their letters allude to horror without naming it. And in that silence, imagination fills the space. Folklore, on the other hand, does not fear specifics. The oral tradition that carried the beheading story forward uses details freely, sometimes too freely. One version says the head was never found. Another claims it was placed upright on a stump. Still another says it was taken as a war prize, carried away by those who intended to deliver a message. But oral tradition is not a courtroom. It is a river, winding and splitting, carrying silt and memory in equal measure. So where, then, does the truth lie? To answer that, we must look not at the act itself, but at the forces that birthed the legend. The settlers at Center Creek lived in fear of unfamiliar land, fear of powerful native warriors, fear of being isolated, fear of losing the world they had sacrificed so much to build. In such an environment, a violent death could become magnified, its details sharpened or darkened to reflect the emotional reality rather than the literal one. The legend of the beheading may not have needed to be factual to feel true. It only needed to reflect the terror that settlers felt as violence crept closer to their cabins. On the other side, the Osage worldview had no place for the sensationalism found in settler accounts. Their stories did not dwell on spectacle. When violence occurred, it was folded into the larger narrative of survival, balance, and the disruption of the natural order. If a man was killed, if his body was found in an unusual state, the meaning behind the act mattered more than the method. Was it done in anger, in self-defense, in retribution, in ritual? These were the questions that mattered. The physical details, gruesome or not, were secondary, and it is precisely this difference that fuels the gap between truth and legend. The settler memory fixated on the visual. The Osage memory focused on the why. When combined, the two form what scholars now call a memory fracture, a place where cultural perspectives no longer align, leaving behind an event that exists in both worlds but in different forms. This fracture becomes even more apparent when studying one of the most influential retellings, the Center Creek Headless story, preserved in fragments through the early 1900s. The account, recorded from an elderly settler woman whose grandparents lived near the creek, describes a man found cruelly handled, his scalp torn, his face battered beyond knowing. In one version, she told, the head was missing. In another, recorded only a few years later, the head was present but disfigured past recognition. Scholars who studied the discrepancy noted that traumatic stories often fracture into more than one version, each containing some emotional truth but not necessarily factual certainty. Interestingly, the Osage oral account collected much later does not deny a violent death occurred. It simply states that the settlers misunderstood the act. One elder said, they saw the shape, not the reason. Another explained that in times of conflict, people often died in ways that frightened their families into believing something darker had been done. The Osage versions never mention beheading directly. They focus instead on a struggle, a confrontation, and an act carried out under desperate circumstances. And yet, despite all this complexity, the legend remains deeply rooted. Why? Because the Ozarks themselves nurture legend. These hills are old, older than the Appalachian Mountains, older than the settlements built in their folds. They encourage slow stories, thick stories, stories that gather moss. The land is not neutral. It carries mood. It holds silence the way a cave holds cold air. It allows memory to hang in the hollows, catching in the folds of rock and soil. In such a place, a story does not need to be precise to endure. It only needs to evoke the right feeling: fear, loss, mystery, an unfinished ending. The beheading story carries all of these, and so it lives. The question that rises now is not whether the story is true, but what the story reveals about the people who carried it forward. It reveals fear, yes, but also longing for meaning, for closure, for understanding. It reveals distrust, but also a buried recognition that both sides suffered in ways neither recorded fully. It reveals how a single moment, whether factual or exaggerated, can become a lens through which generations interpret a landscape. The moon climbs higher, whitening the creek's surface, and its light falls upon the old artifacts sometimes found along the banks: flint flakes, broken pottery, rusted tools, buttons smoothed by time. These are the physical remnants, the things we can hold in our hands. But the story of Center Creek exists in a different layer, not in the earth, but in the breath of those who speak it. And so the moonlit water carries us into the next chapter, its glow slipping across stones older than memory. It leads us toward the cultural inheritance that the story shaped, toward the way this legend sculpted the identity of the Ozarks more deeply than any map, any deed, any forgotten treaty. A shadow passes across the hills now, slow, soft, and long, and its fading line ushers us into the next part of the journey. The shadow that drifts across the hills lingers just long enough to remind us that nothing in the Ozarks ever fades cleanly. Every ridge, every hollow, every quiet bend in a creek holds echoes that rise when the world slows down, echoes shaped by the stories people carry through generations. And among these echoes, the tale of the Center Creek beheading has left one of the deepest impressions. Not because the details are clear, but because the mystery refuses to loosen its grip. It has shaped the identity of the Ozarks in ways subtle and profound, coloring how people understand danger, community, land, and the fragile line between truth and legend. If you speak with old families who have lived here for 3 or 4 generations, they will tell you that the Center Creek story became part of the region's psychological terrain. Not merely a warning, but a reference point. A reminder that the Ozarks, for all their beauty, have always been a place where coexistence required constant negotiation between people, between cultures, between the living and the dead. The story did not survive simply because of its violence. It survived because it spoke to a deeper truth, that life in these hills has always been shaped by tension, uncertainty, and the quiet knowledge that the land does not easily surrender its past. In the decades after the removal of the Osage, the frontier spirit of the Ozarks hardened. Families built schools, churches, mills. Towns sprouted where only game trails had once crossed. But underneath these new structures, the old tensions hummed like distant thunder. Young men learning to hunt were warned not only about terrain and wildlife, but about old dangers that the land still remembered. Teachers introducing children to local history often slipped into storytelling mode when they reached the tales of conflict between settlers and native peoples. The beheading at Center Creek, whether treated as fact or legend, became shorthand for the uncertainty of the early frontier. It was invoked not to inflame hatred, though some did use it that way, but more often to illustrate the fragility of the world their ancestors had built. Folklore in the Ozarks has always served a dual purpose: protection and preservation. Protection because stories help people identify danger, real or imagined. Preservation because stories carry the emotional truths that history textbooks cannot. The Center Creek tale carried both. It protected children from wandering too far into the woods alone. It preserved the collective memory of a time when lives were easily lost and stability was never guaranteed. Even those who doubted the literal beheading still felt the weight of the story, as if the land itself whispered caution in their ears. But the influence of the story reached beyond fear. It shaped identity, how people saw themselves in relation to the land and to one another. Many of the families who settled near Center Creek felt their survival validated by the hardships faced by earlier generations. They inherited the land not only physically, but psychologically, believing that enduring the dangers of the frontier made their roots stronger. And embedded in that sense of endurance was the beheading story, a dark proof of the risks their ancestors had faced. It is not unusual even today to hear someone say, "These hills remember more than we do," and when they say it, they often have Center Creek in mind. The story also influenced how the Ozarks remembered the Osage. In some communities, the tale deepened prejudice, reinforcing a narrative of Native violence without acknowledging the broader context of removal, starvation, and desperation. But in others, particularly those closer to documented Osage trails, people grew to understand the story as part of a larger tragedy shared by all who lived through the era. There are families who speak solemnly of the Osage, honoring their strength, acknowledging their suffering, and recognizing that the violence of the frontier did not belong to one group alone. For them, the beheading story became a symbol not of savagery, but of loss, of lives, of worlds, of ways of understanding one another. This more nuanced interpretation grew stronger over time as researchers, historians, and tribal descendants sought to heal old misunderstandings. By the late 20th century, schools in the region began to incorporate more balanced teaching about the Osage, emphasizing their culture, diplomacy, and the complexity of their decisions during the frontier years. The Center Creek story was still taught, but with emphasis on uncertainty, bias, and the nature of myth-making. Students learned that absence of clarity is as important as presence of fact, that when people do not fully understand what happened, they reach for stories to fill the void, and those stories often tell us more about the people who created them than about the event itself. Yet even with this clearer understanding, the emotional power of the story remains. Ask anyone who grew up near the creek, and they will tell you it still carries a strange atmosphere at dusk. They will talk about moments when the woods suddenly quiet, when the trees seem to draw closer, when the air thickens as though remembering something unsaid. They will tell you about hunters who refuse to track game in certain hollows after dark, about children who dream of figures watching from the timberline, about dogs who will not cross particular fords. These behaviors persist not because people believe the beheading happened exactly as legend says, but because the legend, true or not, taught them to listen to the land. This is perhaps the most enduring impact of the Center Creek story. It instilled in the Ozarks a sense of alertness, a humility before the land, a belief that the landscape holds its own will. Even today, some farmers say they can feel when a part of their property wants to be left alone. Hunters sometimes speak of places where the woods don't welcome footsteps. Hikers recall walking through certain stretches and feeling watched, not in a frightening way, but in a solemn one, as though treading through a memory-laden space. At the same time, the story has shaped the way the Ozarks wrestling with its own identity. This region has always been caught between the old and the new, between ancestral memory and modern reinvention. The legend of the beheading at Center Creek embodies this tension perfectly, a story ancient in tone, modern in interpretation, and timeless in emotional weight. It symbolizes the unsettled nature of the hills, the constant negotiation between visibility and invisibility, between what is known and what is left unsaid. And as the story has grown, it has also become a way for people to confront their own shadows. Some see in it the reminder that violence scars everyone involved. Others see a cautionary tale about misunderstanding, prejudice, and the consequences of failing to see one another clearly. Still others view it as a necessary chapter in the long, difficult history of a region that has always lived with ghosts. Ghosts of the land, ghosts of the people who walked it, ghosts of the choices that shaped the Ozarks into what it is today. Now, standing on the ridge as night deepens, the shadow that once passed across the hills fades into the larger dark. The land returns to its stillness, carrying all the stories it has held for centuries. In the hush that settles, we feel the old legends retreating, curling themselves back into the roots and stones. But one question remains, lingering softly, almost tenderly. What does it mean to live in a place shaped by stories that never fully resolve? That question rests with us as we step into the final chapter, where the land will speak its own quiet truth.